3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Code With Me videos for Chapter 11. In this video, we're going to be talking about using different web fonts. First thing is, go ahead and load up Google Fonts in your browser by going to fonts.google.com. On the right-hand side, we're going to deselect everything in the checkbox except for display. This will actually narrow down our selection of roughly 2,000 or so fonts to just the selection that we want. Then as far as sorting, we're going to sort by alphabetical to make it easier to find the fonts that we want. To give you a good idea about what Google Fonts does is it gives you a good sort of referenceable API or server resources for you to use for different fonts on your website. These fonts may not be installed on your client's computer, but because it's referencing the Google API, as long as the Google API is up, you can use these fonts for personal or professional use. Now the fonts you see right here, you're seeing about 300 or so based on the selection that we have, and you may notice that each item, each font, may have a different phrase. Yours may be different from mine. Basically what's happening is that this is the Google font equivalent of the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. It may not have all the letters, but this gives you a good idea about what these letters and the most common letters will look like once you actually apply the font. If you go into the font itself and actually try to type in the area where the text is, such as I am an awesome coder, then you can see what your specific phrase will look like with the applied font. You can scroll up and scroll down and see what the different fonts are. But instead of copying and pasting this phrase into every single box, you can actually press Apply to All Fonts, and it will copy this and put it in all of the different font boxes so you can easily compare which fonts you want to use. As soon as you're ready to select a font, click the little plus sign so that it can be added to your cart. You're not going to be buying these fonts because the fonts are free, but you're adding it to your cart so that you can use them once you actually get them added to your page. So the first font we're going to be using is actually a very specific font. We're going to go down here to the F's and look for a font called Freckleface. So we're going to select that font by pressing the plus sign right here. And it's going to make a little black box pop up in the bottom. If you select it, you'll see it says one family selected. Technically it is a font family, and our selection is this one font, and I'll get to the rest in just a minute. If you want, you can also search for a specific font if you know what it is, or you can keep scrolling up and down. Well, I don't have time to scroll up and down through all of these, and I know which specific font I want. So I'm going to search for it, called Goblin, and the font is Goblin 1. Perfect. Add the plus sign. Now it's selected too. Now we're done. What we're going to do is we're actually going to click on the black box to pull this back up, and it gives us our two fonts that we want. The load time right here means that once we load the fonts from the Google API servers, that means that the load times for this font is going to be, or these fonts, is going to be very, very fast, which means that it's going to take less than a microsecond or a few to actually load this from the servers. That's a good thing. If you get to load time slow or load time medium, then that means that the Google servers are really, really working hard to get to your fonts. But it may not be the best thing as it's going to take a lot of resources. If you're loading just one or two fonts, you should be perfectly fine. If you're loading about 15 fonts, well, you need to reapproach your strategy. First thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure we are embedding our font, not embedding the style, but instead embedding the font frame. We're going to use the standard format, and that means it's going to give us this right here. It's going to give us a link tag, the hyperlink reference to an external page on the Google API servers, and listing the font families. In this case, Freckleface. Since it has a space in it, it's going to be separated by a plus sign, and then Goblin 1, which Goblin 1 has the same thing, so it has a plus sign. But it's separating these two by using the pipe character by saying, hey, we have more than one font and we're going to separate it using the pipe character. That's perfectly fine. So what you can do is you can actually copy this right here, all the way from the opening to the closing triangle bracket. Going to resize this so we can get back to our brackets. And inside your HTML file, we're actually going to be adding this to our head section. So now we have two link tags inside of our head. And the link tag for this one again references the external style sheet on the Google API server. You also want the relationship to equal style sheet so everything works. If you save and you refresh your page, there's not much visual difference because we've loaded the resource, but now we're not using it. So now we need to use the resource. In your CSS, we're going to go into the H1 right here. We're going to modify this so that we can actually use one of our selected fonts. In this case, we're going to delete Georgia and say Freckle Face. Now, we also need a fallback font, in which case cursive is a great fallback font. Now don't forget, because Freckleface is two words and it has a space in it, we can't just add a plus sign there. That doesn't make any sense. So instead, we're keeping the space and wrapping it inside double quotes. So once we save, we go back to the page, we refresh, we now see, hey, the H1 now uses a font that's not installed on our machine, not installed on your machine, but is being loaded via the Google API font system. So that way, we make it nice and easy to load different fonts on our page. If we somehow misspelled Freckleface or we even forgot the space in the middle, then the browser itself would just load a basic cursive font. Again, the fallback. If you decide that you want to add the plus sign because that's the way it is in the URL, then that doesn't make any sense because Freckle plus face isn't a font. Instead, Freckle face, the two words, works perfectly. But we're not done yet. We need to add the other one, Goblin 1. Otherwise, it's just a wasted resource. We're going to add that to H2. So all of this right here, get rid of. I'm going to say Goblin 1. And this is also a cursive font. So we save, we refresh, and now the H2 changes as well. Yay, that works. We're adding external fonts on our site. However, if you try to validate your HTML, you may notice you have some errors, such as the plus sign, the equals, or even the pipe. Well, the HTML validator doesn't work quite well with the pipe, so a workaround is to use the import. If we delete that line and go straight back to the one link, we save, we notice that, well, now our file or our fonts are gone and it's not working well. So what we're going to do is actually in the CSS file, we're going to be adding the same thing but in CSS. So go back to Google Fonts, and instead of the standard option, click the import option. Now this should look fairly similar to one of the slides in the lecture. But instead of copying everything between style and closing style, we're just going to copy the import line. We copy that, go back to our CSS, and the very first line, we paste. Therefore, the next line starts HTML. You always want to import before you start your standard CSS. So we go back to the page, we refresh, and now we're back to where we're supposed to be. Our H1 has the appropriate font, H2 has the font, and we're good to go. And if you try to validate your HTML, it should not give you any errors or warnings because now everything works as it should be. That is it for this video. We have one more video left and that deals with validating your CSS. If you have any questions regarding this or anything in Chapter 11, please send me an email or hit me up on Twitter and I'll get back to you with the best possible answer.